Hi guys, welcome back. So today we are going to do another kind of technical video. And today we're going to talk about composition. And so composition is one of those things that we all know about, whether we know that we know about it or not. And I know that doesn't make any sense, but it will hopefully by the end of this video. But this is not just applicable to painting, it's also applicable to taking photographs or making spreadsheets or making a PowerPoint presentation. Any form of visual medium, composition plays an important role. And so we're going to go through some basic faux pas that a lot of people fall, like tricks and tips that will help you stay out of it, and faux pas that people can kind of fall into when they're making art or anything else in a visual medium. And then I'm going to make two paintings, one where I try to have good composition and good things that we talk about, and I'll do one that does all the wrong things, and hopefully we'll be able to tell which one makes for a better painting in the end. So I've already filmed the little intro section where I talk about it, so we're going to jump to that and then we'll hop into the paintings, so stay tuned. Okay, so let's talk about some of these do's and don'ts of composition before we get started here. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is centering. So there's plenty of good ways to compose a painting, and a centered image or painting could still be a good one. Think of Wes Anderson. He's a filmmaker. He made like Fantastic Mr. Fox and Isle of Dogs and the Grand Budapest Hotel. Duh. Okay, sorry. He does a lot of centering in his movies, which is fine. However, typically, we're not all Wes Anderson. So having an object dead center of a painting like this is not usually a good idea, because that's pretty boring. That's a very boring composition. And so there's this thing called the rule of thirds, which says if you were to divide your picture up like it's a game of tic-tac-toe, if you put your focal point along one of these third lines or one of these intersections, it'll make for a more interesting painting. And so if instead of doing this, I were to do my focal point here, for example, or if I had, like a tall focal point, if I did it here, that's going to be more interesting than putting it right in the center, usually. So the next thing we can get to is lighting. So let's say that we're following good centering or a rule of thirds, right? And we have an object here. We'll say it's like an apple is our focal point for this painting, right? If I give it very flat lighting, so the shadow is directly underneath it, and the apple just sticks out and it's a little darker at the bottom, right? That's very boring. Versus, for example, if I were to have some lighting off from the side, I could have the same apple, right? But the shadow comes across this way, and there's a shadow side to my apple versus a light side to my apple. That will make for a more interesting composition. You see how already that's kind of making things more interesting, which is kind of the whole point of a good composition, is it's interesting. So following along, next we come into tangents. Now a tangent is when two shapes meet one another at a point. So for example, let's say we're making a composition that has an apple and a banana, right? And so let's put this X and checks next to all the good and bad ones. And so this being a bad one, an apple and a banana, if they were to do one of these numbers here, looks kind of more like a pepper than a banana, but you get the point. Where they meet at one point, that's bad. That kind of builds tension. We don't like tension. We want an interesting painting, and that kind of weird tension is not something that we really like. If things are going to overlap, you got to make sure you overlap them. So for example, let's put the banana back in here. the banana is going to be in front of our apple, right? If it's going to be in front of the apple, we got to make sure it's in front of the apple, or vice versa. If the apple's in front, we got to make sure it's in front of the banana. We don't want them to just touch each other at the edge, because that is no bueno. It's hard to explain, but your kind of brain understands it intuitively. This is more interesting. It creates more depth than this does. It looks very flat when everything is perfectly next to each other. Something else to think about is texture. So for our sample pieces, I'm going to be painting some flowers, right? And so flowers are one of the things that can have very interesting texture, right? So for example, my sample piece is going to be some baby's breath, which has a very delicate texture. So let's say that here is my baby's breath, right? That's very delicate, very heavy texture on this flower. If in the background, I also have a very intense, very heavy texture, it's going to lose that image that I'm looking for. You see, you can hardly see it here. Whereas I would rather have, if I'm going to have something heavily textured here, I want my background to be smooth. Not this, I want it to be a smooth background. It doesn't have to be pure white, right? So for example, the baby's breath is white. So if I have a smooth, dark background, I'm not going to color all that in. This will stand out better versus something heavily textured. You want contrast, right? That's kind of the main thing that you can have in all of these, is you want some kind of intrigue, some kind of contrast. If everything looks the same or is put dead in the center with poor lighting and is dead next to each other, it's going to look flat. We don't want paintings to look flat. They're already flat. We don't want to intensify the flatness of a painting. And so same kind of deal with focus. If I've got a painting that I'm trying to make, right? And for example, the one that I'm going to be doing is a vase with some flowers in it. If I want the focus to be the flowers on the, I don't have to do the whole vase, right? So for example, my vase looks like this, and I've got some flowers in it. That's very zoomed out, very unfocused. And let's say that I've got just a standard background behind it, right? Nothing crazy. But with it way zoomed out like this, the focal point becomes the whole thing and not necessarily the flowers that I'm trying to get towards. So for example, right, if I want to focus on the flowers, maybe I'll zoom in a little more on the flowers. So I don't need all of this information here. I can cut this off way up here and let the flowers be the focal point, right? And that way, I know kind of what I'm focusing on. Now, I could put it in a corner, right? I'm worried about the focal point. But if I have 100 things that are all equally important in the eye of the viewer, it's going to lose some of that interest and focus versus one thing very specifically, obviously being focused on. I keep forgetting the X's and checks, but you get the idea. And finally, edges. And so we got to pay attention to our edges. So for example, a bad example of edges would be, say, I'm continuing on with my vase here. If the vase goes like this and cuts off right at the edge of the paper, that's not a good composition, right? We want some space here. Or if I've got an apple like we did earlier and it's sitting right on the bottom of the canvas with nothing underneath it, that's a bad edge. Kind of like our tangents, we don't want things to cut off right along the edge. Or in the same vibe, we don't want it to be perfectly cut in half or in a quarter up in the corner like that. We want to give it some space to breathe in the canvas. And so, for example, instead of putting our vase right on the edge, we want to give it some space off of the side, right? Or instead of our apple sitting right here in the corner, we want to give it some room to breathe. Or if it's going to be cut off, we want it to be cut off enough that we can tell that that's the point, but not so much that it's cut in half. if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. And so along with I'm going to take these kind of descriptions and rules, and I'm going to try to use all of these bad examples to make a painting. And I'm going to try to use all of my good examples to make a painting. Tangents might be a little hard because I think I'm going to do one focal point, but we'll see if I can come up with something there. But we're going to go ahead and I'm going to make a poorly composed painting and a well-composed painting, and we'll see if we can tell the difference. So we'll get right into that. Okay, so we're going to start with the bad composition. And right out the gate, you can see that I am drawing a vertical kind of subject on a horizontal piece of paper. This, just for starters, is going to leave me a lot of empty room in my page that's going to be unused. And so that's the first kind of faux pas that I'm going to make here. I'm going to center my thing. It's going to be right dead smack dab in the middle. It's not going to be cropped very well. As you can see, the bottom of the vase is kind of sitting right on the bottom of the paper, and it's going to be centered directly in the middle of my piece of paper that's turned the wrong way. And so this, while I could still make a technically sound painting here, it's going to feel kind of empty because there's so much space everywhere else and things are not properly cropped. So you can see the focal point of this painting is supposed to be the flowers. However, I made the whole vase in this page and it's kind of distracting from what I want the actual focus to be. I'm also coming in here, you can see, with a very messy, very loud background, which is going to distract from the texture that my flowers are going to have later. So when I put these flowers in, you'll see that they're not the same color as the background, but their texture is very similar. So if we were to take all the colors away, it would be very hard for you to tell the difference between the texture of the flowers and the texture of the background. I'm also, hopefully at this point, making the actual flowers, and you can see that there's not very hard shadows on anything. Everything's kind of very soft and blends together. And this is another faux pas, like we've talked about, is poor shading or poor lighting choices when I was taking my reference photos. You can see this is lit from essentially straight on, and there's not really many hard or drastic shadows, which is going to make it more difficult for us to be able to tell what's going on in the painting itself. How much I miss not knowing that we're all screwed. When we play our roles and ignore the problems. So as I get toward finishing with this poorly done piece, we can see that it's not technically a bad drawing. Technically, I mean like in the technical sense. Like I've drawn the proportions properly, everything is painted what it should be painted. It just is some bad decision making. And so I think that's kind of what it leads down to. Bad decision making or a lack of decision making when you're making the actual drawing for the painting itself. And so we can see the colors, they kind of all blend together. Nothing is really in focus. It's kind of just flat. And that's what we really would like to avoid in our paintings. We don't want boring paintings because people don't want to look at boring paintings. We want people to want to look at our paintings. So take a shot every time I say painting. Please don't. I don't want to send anybody to the hospital. Let's jump over to the good composition, and we'll see how much of a difference just a couple tweaks to decision making can make towards making a good painting. So we should hopefully be able to immediately see a difference in framing of our subject matter. You see, I want the focus to be on the flowers, so we zoomed in to the flowers. Imagine that, right? I've also utilizing my rule of thirds here. I want my focal point to be kind of on one of those third lines or coming across in that general direction. So you can see the vase is kind of coming up from where that third line would be, and it's not butting up directly against the edge. We're making sure that when it's cut off by the edge of the paper, there's purpose and there is plenty of space, so that it's not seeming like it was an accident that we ran out of paper space. We did it intentionally. You should be able to see here, as I'm adding in some background around my flowers, that I'm going for a very strong contrast. I want the flowers to stand out, right? So I want to make sure that they're much lighter and much more detailed than the background. And so I'm kind of just going for a basic color in the background, which is not always the right answer. But in this case, when the subject matter has a lot of texture, I want to limit the texture in my background so that it stands out. So very dark, very not flat, but very untextured background is going to help these flowers to really pop off of the page, which is ultimately what we're going for. Now that I have added my dark background, I can come through and add some smaller texture details and some stronger shading to our flowers so that they don't seem like just a big flat blank piece of nothingness right there. And once again, I'm going to come through with some pens to do some detail work. In this case, because the background is fairly flat, this pen detail work is actually going to help to provide some much needed definition to the actual flowers themselves, as opposed to just cluttering things up and making it hard to tell what's going on. I took a little bit more time with this painting than I did on the first one. Of course, it's going to happen. I'm being more intentional. However, I don't think that I had to spend so much more time and so much more work on this painting compared to the first one that it's not worth doing. It's just a couple little decisions in the beginning process that helped me to create a much better painting overall. Okay, so now that we're finished with both of these paintings, I'm going to come back to you and talk for a little bit. We'll show off the paintings and then we can get the heck out of here. All right. So first painting, let's give it a look. I've got it over here to the side. Bam. So you see, it's not a bad painting. I wouldn't call this a poorly executed painting, but you can see there's not a lot of focus. There's a lot of very similar colors and tones, a lot of textures that kind of just compete with each other. And as you can see, I feel like I've wasted a lot of this paper. This would have been better had I cropped in harder, right? Had I turned my page vertically, this would have been better. We're just simple things. If I'd have thought a little bit before starting, that could have made a huge difference for the outcome of this painting. Now let's jump on to the one where I did make those decisions a little better. And we can see this is the same exact subject matter. It's the same flowers and the same vase, but a little more intentionality to how it's laid out and the process in which I'm using. And you can see this makes for a much more interesting painting. There's a lot more going on, not so much physically, but emotionally, there's a lot more going on. This carries a lot more motion and power to it. And I hope you can tell that there is definitely a difference between the two. Let me try to get both of them up at the same time so we can see the same subject matter. One painting, this one is kind of flat. The other painting, my purple one here, is significantly more interesting and fun to look at least in my opinion. My opinion, right? However, I think in most cases, the second painting with stronger focus and stronger contrasts and better framing and better composition is definitely going to be the one that most people prefer. I think that's going to do it for today's video. So if you did enjoy, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, ring the bell, all the standard YouTube things. If you are interested in joining me in a class, the first link in my description will have a link to a Valentine's Day class coming up on Valentine's Day at the restaurant that Hillary works at, Rondeo's Pizzeria. It's off of McGregor Boulevard in Fort Myers. I'm going to be doing a couples class where we are going to be making these paintings. Hopefully I remember to put that in there so I don't look stupid. If you and your significant other, or you just by yourself, want to come to this class and you're interested in making this painting and following along with me or meeting me in person, please don't worry about skills or abilities. I'm going to be there to help you complete these paintings and make something that you're really happy with. Come through, hit me up, click the link, go to the website. You can see all of my paintings. You can sign up for this one, or you can come see me at Art Walk, which is coming up first Friday of every month. So it's in a couple weeks from now. We're about halfway through January. So the first Friday of February, I'll have an art walk downtown. And then a few weeks later will be that class. Hopefully, if you guys are interested in any of that, you'll come see me. You can sign up online for the class. I can't wait to see you guys in the next video. See you later.